Hi everybody, it's Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the My Creative Scrapbook limited edition kit for November 2024. The November 2024 kit featured a beautiful collection from Simple Stories called Simple Vintage Yuletide. And I made a layout like this or similar to this before, and I used a lot of paper to make it. And I remember somebody, and I understand why they wrote this, as a comment said, I would never use this much paper. And I understand that paper is precious, especially with how much one sheet of scrapbooking paper costs today. So for this layout, I'm going to use the same basic idea, but I'm not going to use quite as much paper. I try very hard not to use pattern paper in an area that I know I'm going to be layering things on top of, or not a lot of paper or whole sheets. So you'll see that I try to economize a little bit. I don't know about you, but I've been scrapbooking for a very long time and I have a lot of cardstock in my stash. I don't really use it as much as I used to, and I also have a whole lot of white paper, so I don't work too hard to conserve those papers. I mean, I don't want to waste them either. So I use those a little bit more liberally, and then I am much more careful with the pattern paper. So for the first layers, I started with a piece of red cardstock, and then I cut a piece of pattern paper, the one with the holly branches on it, a little tiny bit smaller, and I layered that on top. I gutted it first, and then I used some Martha Stewart punch around the page punches, remember those? And I made another layer. I think you have to cut the paper to 10.5 inches for the border punch and the corner punch to work together. Otherwise, it's not spaced properly. So that was my next layer. And then I added plaid paper on top of that, cut a little bit smaller than the white paper. So that's already a good amount of paper. And then on top of that, I have a square that I place kind of like a diamond. And I have a few strips of green paper that I'm going to be working with in a little while to create another border. So I was feeling pretty good about the layers that I had already cut out, and I'm ready to attach them together. I'm using some Forest Moss Distress Oxide, and I'm inking the edges of this piece of pattern paper. And then I flip it over and add some adhesive to the back of it. Sometimes I find these gutted pieces of paper are a little floppy and they could be a little difficult to work with. But I didn't want to add another piece of paper to this layout that's going to have a lot of paper on it. So I decided to kind of take my chances and work with this piece of paper. But you could see I struggled a little bit to get it lined up correctly. I find it so much easier just attach a piece of paper that I know I'm not going to use to it and then attempt to layer it and add adhesive to it. But luckily I got it attached down so that the red border around the outside of it looks pretty even. I'm once again using the Forest Moss, and I'm inking the edges of my cardstock that I use my punches on. And as I was doing that, it looks like I found a couple of spots that it didn't punch out all the way, so I fixed those with my scissors. And now I'm going to attach the piece of white paper in the middle of that before I attach the green paper down to the background. So this whole layout is just layering, layering, layering. And because there's so much layering of paper, that kind of created an element in itself. So I don't add quite as much embellishing as I normally do. I still add some. So you can see that for each of the layers, not the white layer, but for the other layers, I'm using some Distress Oxide to ink the edges. And that's just something that I think makes the edges look finished. So I'm fitting that piece of plaid paper in, and now I'm going to attach the whole thing down, and I'm trying to be careful each time I add a layer to center it perfectly. So a lot of this layout has to do with measuring. It's a lot of measuring, and that's not something that I love to do, but I do like the results, so I think that it's worth it. So now I'm going to use one of my techniques that I like to use when I don't have a ton of paper. I don't usually make layouts that have so many layers like this, so I generally use this approach when I'm creating a mat for the whole layout, or when I have a photo that I want to mat and I need to use a certain color and I don't have a lot of it left. You really just need some scraps of whatever paper you want to put along the edge as a mat. So here I have my red background. I'm going to be cutting these green strips just a tiny bit smaller than the red paper so that there'll be a little bit of red visible around the edge. And then I have the 4 strips of paper. 2 of them I leave as is, and the other 2 I cut 45-degree angles in the corners. And I will fold down the paper to help me make that 45-degree angle, and then I'll use that angle as a kind of template for the other angles. And this way, even if it's not a perfect 45-degree angle, at least all of the angles are the same. So I apologize if this is getting a little repetitive and monotonous, but I wanted to show you the whole process in case you want to make a page like this. Now I'm adding another piece of white paper, this one cut a little bit smaller than the green mat that's underneath it. And then for the top layer, I wanted to use this green paper. You could see though that I've already used this green paper, and I have a good amount of it left, but not enough to cover this whole piece of white paper. But that's okay because I'm going to be putting my photos on top of this layer, so those holes that you see are going to be covered up. And this isn't a perfect match. If you look really carefully at the final layout, you could see that some of the dots look a little bit different in their direction than some of the other dots, but I don't think that's super noticeable. So I went ahead and I attached those pieces of paper down. And at long last, that's the end of me layering these larger pieces of paper together. I wanted to put a border along the edge of the paper that I'm going to be putting on kind of the diagonal. So I used a paper punch that I had in my stash. I punched out 4 long strips of paper, and I put some adhesive on the back of the square, and I'm attaching all 4 of them down. When I was attaching them down, my concern was how I was going to handle the corners where the 2 pieces of paper meet. I wasn't sure how I could trim them so that it would look neat in the corners, or I was thinking maybe I could put a jewel or some kind of embellishment where the 2 pieces of paper meet. But the good news is it turns out I didn't have to worry about that because I end up being able to slice off the paper at that spot, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment. I drew little pencil marks in the center of the page on the top, the bottom, and both sides so that I could use those to line up the points of this square. I wanted to make sure that I placed the shape correctly on the page. And then I used a pencil and I marked off where I had to cut those strips. You could see that you don't see where the 2 pieces of paper meet because that part was removed. So that was good news for me. I wanted to mention that if you want to make a layout that's like this, you definitely don't have to use so many layers of paper. It's not necessary to have all of these layers, but I still think it's nice to have the square on top of the square. I think that's kind of a cool composition. Now I'm going to add my photos to the background. I have my 2 photos that are mounted on some white cardstock, and then I'm mounting them again on that same red cardstock that I used on the rest of the layout. So even though we're adding so many pattern papers and embellishments to these pages, I still want my photos to be the focal point of my layout. So on this layout, red is definitely the most prominent color, so that's why I chose to put a red mat around the photos so that they would stand out. So it's finally time to embellish this layout. And for this layout, my dilemma was what color to make the flower at the top of the page. I started off with 2 layers of flowers. I think I might have removed those from some other flowers. Sometimes I want to make flowers smaller, so probably for another layout I remove those layers so that I would have a smaller flower to work with. So I used those 2, I layered them on top of each other and put them at the top. And then I added some other really pretty flowers with some gold centers, and then some leaves that I painted gold. And all of these flowers come in the kit. And then for the poinsettia at the top, I added a smaller flower to the center to kind of finish it off, and then added some more of those leaves that I painted. So I really like the way this looks. I end up changing that flower at the top. I'm not sure if I made the right decision. And then for the title, I really liked the size of the title that says Joyful. That's a chipboard sticker. But I was thinking I wanted the title to be red, so I chose this sticker, and I used some Distress Oxide and Antique Linen to make it a little bit more like the pattern papers. If you ever want to change something that's made of paper on your layout from white to kind of a cream color, antique linen is really useful for that. So I kept Amazing there for a little while, and then I decided that I just had to go with Joyful. It just looks so much better there. Even though it's a lot of green, I still decided that it was preferable to the other title, which just didn't stand out as much. So I add a few embellishments around the title, and then I use some adhesive to stick that chipboard title down. I wrote the date on this little tab, and I was going to tuck it to the right-hand side of the layout underneath the photo there, but then I decided that there was just too much going on. So I tried to put it in a couple of different places, but in the end, it gets moved off the page. And then to further decorate the page, I have a star to the right of Joyful. I'm also going to change that. And then I have some sentiments at the tops of the layouts, and those do end up staying there. So I'm adding my favorite little touch here, my photo corners that I use my EK Success photo corner punch to punch out, and I use a branding strip with the same plaid that I have in the background. And I'm not really sure what got me into the habit of using photo corners on like all of my layouts. I really like them, and I just feel like the photos look a little bare without them. And I shouldn't say that I use them on all of my layouts. I don't use them on every single one, but I often feel like something is missing if I don't use them. So you will see them on, I guess I could say, most of my layouts. So I took that star away and decided to just go with these red poinsettias all around the title. I'm using some of the stickers that were in the kit, and I'm fussy cutting off the white border. And I don't know how you feel about white borders. I neither like or dislike them. I just feel that on some pages they serve a purpose and some pages they don't. If that white around the edge is needed to make two things contrast or make the embellishment more noticeable so that it doesn't kind of fade into the background, then I'm all for the white border. But if it's not necessary, if that kind of separation isn't needed, then I'll usually cut it off. And then if some elements have the white border and some don't, then I'll usually cut those off too. There have even been times when I've added a white mat to something. I put a piece of white cardstock behind and then fussy cut out a little mat for a shape. It all depends on the situation and what seems to be needed. Now I'm going to embellish the layout by adding some strips of self-adhesive pearls to that white border that's all around the edge of the green dotted paper. I really love adding these. They work really well. The adhesive works well when you put them on a straight line. And I get these from the Eyelet outlet. They're really not that expensive. I do tend to use a lot of them. So this is one of the items that I've learned to stock up on, because especially when I'm doing my Christmas layouts, I use a lot of them. I don't want to waste them by putting them behind the photos. I also don't want that bulk and bumpiness behind the photo, so I'm just cutting them to fit only in the places where you'll be able to see them. And sometimes I'll use glossy accents if I'm putting these on a curve, because they don't stay as well when they're put on a curve. But glossy accents is a great adhesive to use for things like this. And these are also really useful if you want to have some really, really, really tiny pearls. You can cut these into the individual pieces and use those on your layout too. This is where I decided to change the color of the flower at the top to red. I liked the way the white flower looked, and I liked the way all the flowers were the same color then. And I know I went back and forth, but I finally decided that I really liked this red poinsettia. It goes with the red poinsettias around the title. And I thought that it was a good place on the layout to have some red. So I decided to just go ahead and put that down. And now that I'm looking at it, I could see why I did that. The red does kind of brighten up that spot a little bit. And I suppose that in my mind, I'm a little overly dramatic about making decisions like this. I think that either of the flowers would have looked good there, but I do think that the red one probably looks a little bit better. But it's totally opinion. You might see something different. I love to add things like pearls to my layouts. The color gold is a little bit different than the color gold in the flowers, but I don't think that it matters. And then the leaves are still another color of gold, although these match with the centers of the flowers a little bit better. And the paint that I'm using here is a Prima Art Alchemy metallic acrylic paint, and the color is called Ancient Coin. So I already had painted them, but I guess I was thinking that they needed another coat. They were looking a little bit too green and not gold enough, so I added another coat to each of the leaves. So that's it. The layout is complete. I'm going to include just a couple of close-ups of this page. So I'll be continuing with my effort to get all of my previously recorded videos up on my channel. I have one more Christmas video to voice over this week, so that'll be up on my channel soon, and then I'll start working on some of the other videos. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I'll be back again soon with another video, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.